It was September 13th, 1940, and the desert shook beneath the rumble of engines. From the Libyan frontier, the Italian 10th Army crossed into Egypt in a cloud of dust and bravado. Tanks rolled eastward under the blazing sun, banners snapping in the dry wind, the horizon rippling with heat. Rome called it l'avanzata verso il Nilo, the advance to the Nile. The headlines promised glory, empire, and the rebirth of Roman destiny. Mussolini had declared that fascist Italy would conquer Egypt, link up with German forces, and drive the British into the Red Sea. It was to be his triumph, his chance to prove that Italy too could carve out its place under Hitler's new order. But for the soldiers trudging through the sand, the dream quickly turned to dust. The desert was merciless. Radiators boiled dry, tires shredded on sharp rock, food spoiled in the heat, and water rations ran out faster than the trucks could carry them. Most of the men had never seen terrain like this, an ocean of sand and silence, where even the wind seemed hostile. The officers shouted orders over the roar of engines, but discipline melted under the sun. By September 16th, the Italian advance sputtered to a halt around a small, unremarkable village called Sidi Barrani, just 60 miles into Egypt. The troops dug in, exhausted, disoriented, and unsure why they had stopped. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, the Italian commander, had good reason to hesitate. Mussolini had demanded an invasion, but had given him almost nothing to fight it with. His mechanized divisions were half-motorized at best. His tanks were light, under-armored, and armed with machine guns. His air support was thin, and his troops, many of them colonial conscripts from Libya and Eritrea, were brave but poorly trained, ill-equipped, and stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. Graziani, a cautious bureaucrat more than a field general, decided to wait. He halted his forces, fortified their positions, and built a chain of camps running from Maktila to Safafi, each one ringed with trenches, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches. He planned to dig in and hold until reinforcements arrived. For Mussolini, it was humiliation. He had promised the world a victory in Africa, a lightning conquest that would outshine Hitler's campaigns in France. Instead, his army sat idle, cooking pasta over oil drums in the sand. The propaganda in Rome kept boasting of progress, but the truth was clear. The Italian war machine was stalled, paralyzed in the desert. To the east, the British watched from across the dunes. The Western Desert Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, numbered barely 36,000 men. They were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. Their tanks were few and mostly outdated, their trucks patched together with spare parts, their air force limited to a handful of hardy Gladiator biplanes and Blenheim bombers. And yet, O'Connor's men were professionals, disciplined, trained, and hardened by months of desert warfare. They knew how to live in this emptiness, how to hide, how to move. Where the Italians saw isolation, O'Connor saw opportunity. The British commander himself was a quiet man, calm, analytical, with a patience that masked audacity. His superior, General Archibald Wavell, trusted him implicitly. Together, they studied the Italian line and saw its fatal flaw. Each fortified camp was miles away from the next, too far for mutual support. Graziani's army, though huge, was strung out like beads on a broken necklace. If struck quickly, each camp could be destroyed before the others even reacted. Wavell authorized what he called a 5-day raid. It sounded cautious, almost routine, just a limited operation to test Italian defenses. But O'Connor saw the potential for something far greater. The code name was Operation Compass. The plan was as bold as it was simple. The 4th Indian Division and the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, would strike west from the British base at Mersa Matruh, loop south into the desert, and attack the Italian southern flank at Nibewa. They would move silently through the night, guided only by compass and stars, and hit the camp at dawn. Once Nibewa fell, the British would sweep north, destroying the other Italian positions one by one. But to do that, they had to master the desert itself. It was a place of extremes, scorching heat by day, freezing cold by night, silence so complete that soldiers could hear the ticking of their own watches. Sandstorms could blot out the sun, mirages could make tanks appear where none existed. Yet the British adapted. They learned to navigate by constellations, to travel with headlights off, to camouflage in the dunes. In the desert, one officer wrote, the landscape never changes. Only your understanding of it does. By December 8, 1940, the British were ready, Columns of trucks and tanks assembled under a moonless sky near Mersa Matruh. Engines idled quietly. Men sat smoking in the dark, waiting for the order to move. At 10 p.m., the signal came. The desert came alive with the hum of movement. Long columns crawling westward through the blackness, headlights covered, radios silent. The cold was sharp enough to sting the eyes, and the stars burned bright over an endless horizon. A corporal later recalled, "We moved like ghosts, guided by nothing but the compass and faith." Before dawn, the British had reached their attack positions. In the distance, the Italian camp at Nibewa slept, its searchlights turned outward toward the wrong direction, toward the east, expecting an attack from the coast. They had no idea that death was waiting behind them in the western darkness. At 5 a.m., the desert exploded. The thunder of artillery tore through the silence, and the Matilda the Somme tanks rolled forward, slow, hulking beasts, their armor nearly impervious to Italian guns. Machine gunners fired wildly, bullets sparking uselessly off the Matilda's sides. Within minutes, the British infantry followed, bayonets glinting in the firelight. The attack was over by noon. The camp lay in ruins. 4,000 Italians surrendered. Operation Compass had begun, and what was meant to be a small raid would soon become one of the most devastating offensives of the Second World War. By the evening of December 9, 1940, the sands around Nibewa were littered with the wreckage of the Italian 10th Army. Burned-out trucks, smashed gun carriages, and shattered helmets lay scattered across the dunes. The British had taken thousands of prisoners, and not a single Italian counterattack had come. General Richard O'Connor climbed onto the bonnet of his command car and watched the smoke curling into the sunset. The desert wind carried the smell of fuel and cordite. He turned to his staff and said quietly, "They're finished here. Let's keep moving." What had begun as a 5-day raid was already transforming into a full-scale campaign. Through the night, O'Connor's columns swung north, headlights covered, compasses glowing faintly under their tarpaulin covers. They advanced toward the next cluster of Italian camps at Tuma East and West, only a few miles apart. Italian patrols never saw them coming. At dawn on December 10th, the British guns opened up again. Matilda tanks rumbled through the wire as Indian and British infantry followed in waves, their uniforms streaked with sand and sweat. By noon, both camps were overrun. Prisoners streamed out of trenches, hands raised, some shouting, "Finito! Finito!" The British had captured another 8,000 men and dozens of tanks and artillery pieces. As the sun climbed higher, the heat rose above plus 40 degrees Celsius. The air shimmering with mirages. Sweat evaporated before it reached the ground, and metal burned to the touch. Yet O'Connor's men pressed on. Their tanks, though slow, were unstoppable. Italian shells bounced off their armor like pebbles. The Indian infantry fought with remarkable precision, moving from trench to trench in coordinated silence. Within 48 hours, 2 major Italian positions had been wiped off the map. By December 11th, the British reached Sidi Barrani, where Graziani's main headquarters had once stood. The Italians, thrown into panic, attempted to hold their ground with a mix of artillery and outdated tankettes. It was no use. The 7th Armoured Division enveloped the position from the desert flank, while the Indian infantry attacked frontally. By the end of the day, the Italian defence collapsed entirely. O'Connor's men took another 20,000 prisoners. The victory stunned even the British command. In Cairo, General Wavell received the first reports with disbelief. His radio operator recalled him reading the dispatch twice, then saying, "This cannot be right. Tell O'Connor he's done splendidly, but tell him not to overdo it." But O'Connor did overdo it. His momentum was irresistible. The Italian army was disintegrating, its communications gone, its officers paralyzed. Graziani, still in Libya, could barely make sense of the chaos. His subordinates sent desperate messages. "We are surrounded, tanks everywhere, impossible to withdraw." By mid-December, O'Connor's 5-day raid had advanced more than 100 miles. He had taken 38,000 prisoners and destroyed hundreds of vehicles for fewer than 600 British casualties. His men, though exhausted, were elated. A soldier from the 4th Indian Division wrote in his diary, "We hardly sleep, we hardly eat, but the sight of those white flags makes it all worthwhile." The desert, however, showed no mercy. Days scorched at plus 45 degrees Celsius. Nights plunged to near minus 3 degrees Celsius. Engines seized, rifles jammed with sand, and water trucks lagged miles behind. But still they pushed westward, Chasing the fleeing remnants of Graziani's army across the barren coastal plain, the British advance reached the Libyan frontier by Christmas Eve. Graziani's remaining divisions attempted to regroup around the fortified port of Bardia near the border. The town was ringed with minefields, bunkers, and anti-tank ditches, a fortress on paper, but manned by soldiers already broken in spirit. On January 3, 1941, after days of careful reconnaissance, O'Connor struck again. Under the cover of darkness, British engineers cleared the minefields, and at dawn, the Matildas rolled in. RAF bombers screamed overhead, dropping fragmentation bombs on gun positions. The defenders fought briefly, then surrendered in waves. Bardia fell within 48 hours. 45,000 Italians were captured. From the air, the devastation was surreal. British reconnaissance photos showed miles of surrendered columns marching toward prison camps. Long trails of men, weapons abandoned, uniforms coated in dust. One RAF officer described it as an army dissolving into sand. The British press back home could hardly believe it. The Times called O'Connor's offensive one of the most brilliant maneuvers in modern warfare. But the general himself refused to celebrate. "It's not over," he told his staff. "They'll try to make a stand at Tobruk." He was right. The next objective lay deeper inside Libya. Tobruk, another heavily fortified port city guarding the approach to Cyrenaica. The Italians poured what remained of their strength into it, but O'Connor had already learned the rhythm of the desert. Move fast, strike harder, never give the enemy time to breathe. He redeployed his divisions, rested his tanks for only 2 days, and prepared for the next blow. Behind the front, the logistical miracle of the campaign was beginning to strain. Supply lines now stretched hundreds of miles back to Mersa Matruh. Each convoy needed fuel, food, ammunition, and above all, water. The quartermasters joked that, "We carry more petrol for the trucks than we do for the tanks." Yet the men endured. "We didn't feel tired anymore," one British gunner recalled. "We just felt unstoppable." At the same time, the Italians' morale had collapsed completely. Messages intercepted by British intelligence painted a picture of despair. "Our men are starving," one Italian officer radioed. "We have no orders, no fuel, no hope." Graziani himself fled from Benghazi, leaving his staff to improvise defences as best they could. As the new year dawned, Operation Compass had already exceeded every expectation. O'Connor's force, originally told to raid for 5 days, had advanced more than 400 kilometres in less than a month. They had captured over 70,000 prisoners, hundreds of tanks, and vast stores of supplies. But the greatest victory was psychological. The myth of fascist invincibility had been shattered in the sands of North Africa. In Berlin, Hitler was furious. He had trusted Mussolini to handle North Africa while he focused on Europe. Now, with the Italian 10th Army collapsing, he realized the entire Mediterranean front could crumble. "Send reinforcements," he ordered. "The situation must be restored at once." And so, quietly, the Wehrmacht began to prepare a new expeditionary force, the Afrika Korps, under a general whose name would soon dominate the desert, Erwin Rommel. But in December 1940 and January 1941, before the Desert Fox ever set foot in Africa, the sands belonged to another hunter. Richard O'Connor and his men had achieved the impossible, not through numbers or technology, but through nerve, precision, and will. Their advance across the desert would become the blueprint for every mobile campaign that followed. And as they rested near the gates of Tobruk, their uniforms crusted with salt and sand, they couldn't know that this victory, their masterpiece, would soon be overshadowed by the arrival of a new enemy and a new legend. The road to Tobruk stretched across the coastal plain like a scar, endless sand and rock glinting under a pitiless sun. In early January 1941, the British Western Desert Force advanced westward through this landscape, engines growling, dust trailing behind them like banners. The men were worn to the bone, their faces blackened by sun and grease, their uniforms stiff with salt from dried sweat. But morale was high. They had shattered the Italian 10th Army in weeks. Thousands of prisoners trudged east under guard. The desert, once a wasteland of fear, now felt like open country. Ahead lay Tobruk, the fortress city, the last Italian stronghold in eastern Libya. The Italians had poured their remaining strength into Tobruk's defences. Built around a natural harbour, the city had been transformed into a fortress with minefields, anti-tank ditches, and concrete bunkers carved into the limestone ridges. On paper it was formidable, but in reality, It was manned by exhausted soldiers, men who had retreated hundreds of miles under constant air raids, sleeping little, eating less, and haunted by the ghosts of their comrades captured at Bardia. The commander, General Enrico Pitassi Manella, was determined to fight, but his troops had no confidence left. "We are surrounded by the desert," one Italian officer wrote, "and by despair." On January 21, 1941, O'Connor's forces reached the outskirts of Tobruk. The weather was brutal, heat by day reaching plus 42 degrees Celsius, cold nights plunging to minus 2 degrees Celsius. Sand filled every crevice, every barrel, every lung. The men slept in shallow pits, wrapped in blankets that did little against the freezing desert winds. "You could roast by noon and freeze before midnight," one gunner said later. The desert was two different worlds in the same day. At dawn on January 22nd, the attack began. British artillery pounded the outer defences while Matilda tanks and Australian infantry from the 6th Division surged forward. The Matildas once again proved unstoppable. Italian shells bounced harmlessly off their thick armour. The Australians moved fast and ferociously, clearing bunkers with grenades and bayonets. A soldier described the fight in grim simplicity. Dust, smoke, and shouting. Then silence. Every time we moved forward, the line just disappeared. By midday, British and Australian forces had broken through the outer perimeter. Italian positions fell one after another. Some fought bravely to the end. Others surrendered in groups, waving white rags tied to rifle barrels. By evening, Tobruk's harbour was in flames. At 20 hours, General Manella radioed a final message to Rome. "The situation is hopeless. We have done our duty." The message was intercepted by British signals. Less than an hour later, Tobruk was declared captured. The scale of the victory stunned even O'Connor. Over 25,000 prisoners, 230 guns and 200 tanks were taken. The road west was open. For the Italians, it was the death knell of their North African dream. For the British, it was one of the most complete victories in their history. The commander of the 7th Armoured Division summed it up bluntly. "We came to raid. We ended up conquering half of Libya." But O'Connor wasn't finished. His orders from Wavell were cautious: consolidate, hold Tobruk, prepare defences. Yet O'Connor saw an opportunity too good to waste. The Italian army was in full retreat, fleeing west toward Derna and Benghazi. He sent a message to Cairo. "Enemy broken. Request permission to pursue." Wavell hesitated, but Churchill himself encouraged boldness. The Prime Minister, reading the dispatches from Cairo, wrote in his diary, "In the desert, fortune favours audacity." Permission was granted. So the advance continued. Through January and into February 1941, the British pushed deeper into Libya. The 7th Armoured Division raced along the coastal road, while columns of Australian infantry and Indian troops cut through the interior. The Italians tried to regroup at Derna but were outflanked and overrun. The British press called it the Great Desert Chase. One journalist described watching the armoured columns move across the horizon like ships on an ocean of dust. By early February, O'Connor's forces were nearing Benghazi, more than 800 kilometres from their starting point. The Italian army was collapsing completely. Supply convoys were ambushed daily. Morale was gone. Desertion spread like fever. On February 6th, O'Connor ordered one final manoeuvre, a wide flanking movement through the desert south of Benghazi to cut off the retreating Italian columns. It worked perfectly. Near the town of Beda Fom, British armoured cars and anti-tank guns blocked the coastal road. At dawn on February 7th, 1941, the trapped Italians tried to break through. It was chaos. Trucks colliding, tanks burning, soldiers fleeing into the dunes. British artillery tore into the packed columns. The scene, one officer later wrote, looked like a scrapyard exploding. The Italians fought bravely in small groups, but it was hopeless. By nightfall, the survivors began surrendering en masse. Among them was General Giuseppe Tellera, the Italian field commander, mortally wounded while trying to lead a final charge. By the morning of February 8th, the battle was over. In less than 9 weeks, O'Connor's Western Desert Force had advanced more than 800 kilometres, captured over 130,000 prisoners, destroyed 380 tanks, and seized 845 guns. The entire Italian 10th Army had ceased to exist. The campaign was a masterclass in manoeuvre warfare, speed, deception, and timing. A British officer called it the desert's own blitzkrieg. Years before that term became common. But as the Union Jack rose over Benghazi, The men who fought in the sand knew the cost. Engines were breaking down from overuse. Fuel was running low. The desert had taken its toll. Men blistered by the sun, half blind from glare, dehydrated despite the victory. Temperatures climbed above plus 44 degrees Celsius in the day and plunged below zero at night. "We'd won," one private wrote, but the desert felt like it had beaten us anyway. For O'Connor, it was the pinnacle of his career. He had done what few thought possible, destroyed an army 10 times his size. His troops admired him for his calm leadership. His superiors praised him as the architect of Britain's greatest land victory of the war so far. Yet, behind the triumph, new clouds were forming. In Berlin, Hitler had been watching. The collapse of Italy's North African front was an embarrassment the Führer could not tolerate. Within weeks, orders went out. A new German expeditionary force would be sent to North Africa to stabilize the front. Its commander, General Erwin Rommel. The first units of the Afrika Korps landed in Tripoli later that February, their tanks painted yellow and green for desert warfare. While O'Connor's men rested at Benghazi, the next chapter of the Desert War was already beginning, one that would turn hunters into hunted and victory into a desperate fight for survival. The sun set blood red over the Libyan coast that night, and O'Connor stood outside his command tent, the wind stinging his face. "It's over," one of his officers said beside him. O'Connor looked west toward the horizon and answered quietly, "No, it's only begun." The ships arrived under the cover of night, their decks stacked with tanks painted in a strange yellow-green camouflage, the color of a new kind of war. It was February 1941, and the first elements of the Deutsches Afrika Korps were unloading at Tripoli. Among them stood a man who, within months, would become one of the most famous generals in the world, Erwin Rommel. Fresh from his triumphs in France, Rommel was eager, ambitious, and restless. He had been sent to stabilize the Italian position in North Africa, but he saw opportunity instead, a chance to rewrite the story of the desert. The British believed the campaign was over. Rommel intended to prove them wrong. Rommel wasted no time. Even before all his forces had landed, he began moving east with characteristic impatience. His superiors in Berlin told him to wait, to build up supplies, to reconnoiter. He ignored them. "We act," he told his staff, "while the enemy sleeps." His tactics were simple but brilliant. Strike fast, strike deep, and use the desert as an ally. He studied O'Connor's campaign and saw its genius, but also its weakness. Long, thin supply lines and overextended communication. The same desert that had given O'Connor his victory could now destroy him. By March 1941, Rommel's reconnaissance columns, light armoured cars and Panzer III tanks, began to probe eastward. They were small at first, testing British defences, cutting telegraph lines, scattering supply convoys. British patrols reported the presence of new tanks, faster and better armed than anything the Italians had fielded. The first clashes were brief and brutal. In the burning heat, sometimes reaching plus 45 degrees Celsius, the German units struck like vipers and vanished. The British at first assumed they were facing isolated detachments. Within weeks, they realized the truth. The Germans were coming in force. Rommel's advance was breathtaking. By mid-March, his troops had retaken El Agheila, then Mersa Brega, driving the British back faster than anyone thought possible. He understood momentum, the same weapon O'Connor had once wielded. But where O'Connor's advance had been deliberate and precise, Rommel's was instinctive, almost reckless. He operated on intuition, pushing his men beyond limits, often leading from the front. Soldiers later remembered him standing in his half-track, goggles on, dust whipping across his face, pointing forward through binoculars and shouting, "Schneller! Faster!" In Benghazi, panic spread. O'Connor, who had been serving in an advisory capacity under General Philip Neame, was ordered to move east and assess the situation. He didn't hesitate. Despite the fatigue and confusion, he climbed into a staff car with a small escort and set off toward the front to re-establish contact with the retreating units. It was a dangerous decision. The desert was now crawling with German patrols. On the night of April 6, 1941, O'Connor and Neame were driving near Derna when they lost their way in the darkness. The desert at night was treacherous, black and silent, the horizon impossible to read. Their driver turned north when he should have gone east. Moments later, headlights flared ahead. Thinking they were British vehicles, the driver slowed. The first shout, in German, shattered the illusion. Machine guns opened up, bullets slicing the air. They had driven straight into a German roadblock. O'Connor and Neame were taken prisoner almost immediately. The man who had humiliated Mussolini's army was now a captive of Hitler's. When Rommel received word that the British general who had defeated the Italians was in his hands, he smiled thinly. "So," he said, "the desert changes masters again." He ordered that O'Connor and Nimes be treated with respect, a professional courtesy from one soldier to another. Later, when the two met briefly under guard, Rommel greeted him warmly, saying, "You have fought well. Now it is my turn." O'Connor, exhausted and unarmed, replied simply, "I suppose it is." The fall of O'Connor marked the end of the first great phase of the Desert War. Within weeks, Rommel's forces swept through Cyrenaica, recapturing most of the territory the British had won. By April 11th, the Afrika Korps had reached the Egyptian border once again. Only the fortress of Tobruk held out, defended by Australian and British troops who refused to surrender. The siege would last 8 long months, a brutal stalemate of dust, heat, and shellfire. For the men on both sides, the desert itself became the true enemy. Days scorched at plus 46 degrees Celsius. Nights dropped to minus 4 degrees Celsius. Sandstorms blinded drivers, choked engines, and buried trucks overnight. Water was more valuable than ammunition. "The desert eats everything," one German lieutenant wrote. "Machines, men, and mines." From this chaos, the legend of Rommel, the Desert Fox, was born. His daring attacks, rapid maneuvers, and ability to turn retreat into victory earned him both admiration and fear. British newspapers, desperate for explanations, began to speak of him as a genius. In truth, Rommel was many things: brilliant, daring, often reckless. But he was also building upon the foundation O'Connor had laid. The mobility, the feints, the use of terrain, all of it came from lessons learned in that same desert just months before. Back in captivity, O'Connor spent years as a prisoner of war in Italy. He later escaped in 1943 and rejoined the Allied forces in Europe. But the desert campaign that had made his name was long over. History would remember Rommel, the charismatic, photogenic general whose name became synonymous with the North African War. Yet those who had fought under O'Connor never forgot. He was the real fox, one veteran said decades later. Rommel learned in a few months what O'Connor had mastered in a few weeks. By the time 1941 turned to 1942, the desert had changed masters several times. What had begun as Mussolini's dream of empire had become a vast, shifting battlefield of nations. And in that sea of sand, the echoes of both men, O'Connor and Rommel, lingered like twin ghosts. One, the quiet strategist who proved the impossible could be done. The other, the showman who made the desert his stage. Both were bound by the same truth. In North Africa, the desert never forgives arrogance, but it always rewards audacity. As the wind howled over the dunes and the sun sank behind the Libyan horizon, the sands buried the wreckage of both empires, Italian and British, German and Allied, leaving behind only rust, bone, and silence. And in that silence, the story of Operation Compass ended, the forgotten prelude to the legend of the Desert Fox. When the guns finally fell silent over the North African sands, the desert lay strewn with wreckage, burned-out tanks half buried by shifting dunes, twisted steel glinting in the sun, and the bones of men who had fought and fallen in a place that seemed to devour everything. The desert keeps no monuments. It buries its history in silence. Yet beneath that silence, the story of Operation Compass still lingers, not as a grand triumph or a romantic legend, but as one of the purest examples of how strategy, discipline, and audacity can overturn impossible odds. When Richard O'Connor first moved his small Western Desert force westward from Mersa Matruh, few believed he could achieve anything lasting. His orders were cautious, his resources scarce, his objectives modest. But in just 9 weeks, his men advanced nearly 1,000 kilometers, destroyed an entire Italian army, and captured more than 130,000 prisoners. In doing so, they rewrote the rules of desert warfare and, unknowingly, laid the foundation for the campaigns that would follow. O'Connor's success was built on 3 simple principles: mobility, deception, and tempo. He understood that in the open desert, where there are no natural barriers, and every position can be outflanked, victory goes to the side that can move fastest and think ahead. He trained his troops to use the desert like an ocean, to travel light, to navigate by compass and stars, to rely on speed instead of size. His columns struck unexpectedly, hit hard, and disappeared before the enemy could regroup. The Italians, spread thin and immobilized by static defenses, never stood a chance. It was a victory not of machines, but of minds. The Matilda II tanks, though slow, were used with surgical precision, shielded by the terrain, protected by the element of surprise. The Indian and Australian infantry fought with quiet professionalism, enduring the extremes of heat and cold, plus 45 degrees Celsius by day, minus 3 degrees Celsius by night, with a discipline that astonished their commanders. Pilots of the Royal Air Force, flying outdated biplanes, kept relentless pressure on Italian airfields, ensuring the skies belonged to the British. Compass was a symphony of timing, movement, and willpower. A campaign fought with chess-like elegance in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But the desert is a fickle ally. The same openness that allowed O'Connor to outmaneuver his enemies also left him vulnerable once the tide turned. His long, exposed supply lines, his reliance on a handful of armoured units, and his forward momentum, all the strengths of Compass, became weaknesses when the Africa Corps arrived. In that sense, Operation Compass was both a triumph and a warning. It proved that brilliance can overcome numbers, but it also showed that even the best strategy can collapse when the enemy learns from your success. And that's exactly what Erwin Rommel did. The man who became the Desert Fox studied O'Connor's methods in detail. His own lightning strikes, the sweeping flanking maneuvers, the use of speed and surprise, the exploitation of terrain, were echoes of the very tactics the British had pioneered months earlier. In the desert, Rommel found a teacher in his enemy. It was as if the ghost of O'Connor guided him across the dunes, showing him what the desert rewards and what it punishes. For the men who fought in Compass, the memories stayed vivid long after the war. Veterans spoke of the eerie beauty of the desert, the nights lit by tracer fire and stars, the mornings when the sand glowed like gold, the endless taste of dust in their mouths. They remembered comrades lost not just to bullets but to thirst, exhaustion, and exposure. One soldier wrote home, "If you survive here, you feel like the earth itself has tested you and let you go." The victory of Compass changed more than maps. It changed minds. In London,
June 6th,
Churchill called it a striking example of what determination and leadership can achieve. In Berlin, it forced Hitler to intervene directly in North Africa, diverting men and machines that might otherwise have gone east to Russia. In Rome, it humiliated Mussolini and shattered the illusion of fascist power. Strategically, it opened the Mediterranean to new possibilities for the Allies, a preview of the mobile warfare that would define later campaigns in the Middle East and Europe. Yet for all its brilliance, Operation Compass faded quickly from public memory. It was overshadowed by Rommel's rise, by the later seesaw battles at Tobruk, Gazala, and El Alamein. O'Connor himself spent years in captivity, unable to tell his story. When he returned, the war had moved on. History, as it often does, preferred the legend of the man who came after. Rommel had the flair, the propaganda, the myth. O'Connor had only results. But among historians and soldiers, Compass remains a benchmark, a case study in perfect execution under impossible conditions. Military academies still teach its lessons, how initiative at the tactical level can win at the strategic level, how leadership grounded in calm, methodical precision can defeat bluster and arrogance. It is proof that genius in war doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it appears quietly, in the sand, in the silence, in a general who simply refuses to accept that holding the line means standing still. In the desert, victory is fleeting. The wind erases tracks, dunes shift, wreckage sinks beneath the sand. But for a brief moment, between December 1940 and February 1941, the British Western Desert Force achieved something few armies ever have: the perfect balance between strategy and instinct. They turned the most inhospitable landscape on Earth into an ally, and in doing so, reminded the world that courage and clarity can still rewrite history. As the last light fades over the Libyan horizon, the dunes whisper with stories long buried. The rusting hulls of Matildas and Fiats lie half buried in silence. The desert keeps no sides, no loyalties, only echoes. But if you stand there at dusk, the wind in your ears, you can almost hear it still. The engines of a small army moving west through the night, guided only by stars and compass. And somewhere, across the shifting sands of time, Richard O'Connor's voice lingers, calm, quiet, and sure. In war, it isn't who has the most men that matters. It's who moves first and who keeps moving.